have so many questions. Show me the answers. I'm afraid. Why am I here? I've lost the digits. Should I cut a strike? Is the
Welcome back, everyone, to an ordinary search for truth. My name is Nate, and today we're going to be talking about the simplicity that reality is, but also why it's too simple for the mind to comprehend. Of course, what I teach primarily on my channel is non-duality. I talked about in my video, what is non-duality? That non-duality is the exploration of reality, or what is true, what is absolutely true. And it's an exploration of ourselves. And the fact is that the reality that non-duality explores is too simple, too obvious, and too infinite for the mind to comprehend. So I will break it down very simply for you. The truth of non-duality is that there is one fundamental nature and substance of reality, one irreducible element. That fundamental nature, substance, or element, whatever you want to call it, is consciousness. Reality is consciousness, and consciousness is reality. Also, reality is infinite, which means that also consciousness is infinite. You are consciousness, which means that you are reality. And this also means that you are infinite. It is the simplest understanding that there is. And yet, within it is also contained infinite complexity. So within infinite reality is a function, a processing function that we refer to most ordinarily as the mind. The mind is the agent within infinite reality that creates infinite complexity within it. If there was no mind function within reality, then we would see reality exactly as it is, as infinite consciousness. The mind is limited to its functionality. Though the mind is limited within reality, reality is not limited by anything. It is infinite. The mind does have certain limits within which it is capable of functioning. And when I say the mind, I'm not talking about the brain per se. The brain is another subject for another day, but basically the brain is a projection within our experience of very complex mind process. So we have different, more complex brains than, simpler animals, you could say. And that's because our mind is a more complex functioning within reality. A complex function of separation, division, manipulation, labeling, judging, condemning, modeling, researching, exploring. But all of these things are simply projections of this function that we call the mind. If you want more in-depth content about that, go check out my What is Reality Awareness and Its Activity video series. That will go a lot more into what the mind is, how it separates and divides reality, and what that results in within our experience. But essentially, all this division and separation and processing that the mind does within reality is a projection that we perceive, and we have learned to mistake that projection and those limits that we see within the mind as being an accurate and a true reflection of actual infinite reality. Now, it's very easy to see that this is just not the case. Our mind is unable to comprehend infinity. Unable to. We cannot visualize truly infinity. It's beyond the functioning of the mind to do, beyond the functioning of the mind to grasp. So when we perceive reality to be anything other than infinite consciousness, we can know that we are not, in fact, perceiving the truest reflection of what reality actually is, because that's what reality actually is. So if we're not perceiving it as such, that must mean that we are giving that reality to something else. And what we are giving the reality to is the limits and functions of the mind, the activity of the mind. We've mistaken the limitations that the mind projects upon reality to be reality because, well, because we've been taught it from a very young age by those who have made the same mistake. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. It's literally something that reality is doing. This mind process is something that reality is doing. And thus it must be perfect. But it can also cause a lot of problems, a lot of suffering when we equate this processed version of reality as being actual reality, actual infinite reality. There's all sorts of problems and suffering that come along with that. But this is a generational misunderstanding that goes back centuries. That what we are and what everything else is somehow anything other than infinite consciousness. This is something that we had to learn, that was taught to us. These are assumptions that we have made and accepted to be true. Now, at the same time, I cannot overstate the complexity and the potency of the mental matrix that we have of deeply held beliefs and assumptions, which have been given to us, that we've created, that we've accepted, and that are built upon other beliefs and other assumptions. It's essentially this house of cards, this mental matrix that we have built up, that we have received help in building, and it reinforces itself very strongly to the point that it's so believable that what is actually true, which is infinite reality, what's actually real, has become to you unbelievable. To believe that what we are and what everything is non-dual, that it's all infinite consciousness, to believe that is more of a stretch than to believe that it is not that. That's how deep this goes. We've completely flipped the script. And why is this? Because we've identified with the process that the mind goes through. We've identified with the way that the mind tries to process reality, and we've accepted its own limits that the mind has as a function. We've accepted that what the mind cannot understand or comprehend must not be true or must not be real, and we give no reality to that. Even if we have a direct experience of infinite reality, of infinite consciousness, even if we have that as a direct experience, a lot of times the mind will come in afterwards and say, oh, well, that was just a hallucination, or that was just a weird brain state, chemicals, science. It'll just go into all of these explanations that we have, and it'll explain it away because that's what it does. That's what it's supposed to do. But we can choose whether we believe that or not, whether we believe the processed reality or whether we are attempting to connect with the truest reflection of reality, which is ultimately beyond the mind. And this is not because reality is too complex to understand. That's not why. Reality is not necessarily this super complex and intricate thing. It's the simple knowledge that all is consciousness and consciousness is infinite. And that's what is. It's very simple. But the mind cannot comprehend the simplicity of it because it's so simple that it's infinite. And infinite simplicity cannot be understood. So, what can the mind do? All that the mind can do is create infinite complexity within infinite consciousness. That's all it can do. That's what our minds spend the days doing, is making complex what is really quite simple. It's very difficult going through the spiritual journey, especially in non-duality, because all the teachers and all the gurus and everyone talking about it are saying, it's so simple. It's just what is, wake up. Like, it's so obvious. Like, duh. And when you're sitting there listening to that and you haven't actually gotten an understanding of what the mind is and its limits and what infinite reality is, what infinite consciousness is, when you're still very new to that, then you're still very identified with the ego and with the mind limits. So when the mind hears this, it's so simple, it's so obvious, it's blah, 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 the mind is thinking in its own terms of simplicity versus complexity. It's still very conceptual, it's still very mind stuff. And so much of the process of spirituality is not actually understanding more and more and more, getting this greater understanding of complexity and all these little pieces that fit together in this big whole. It's not that. The mind has already offered us that in the form of our mental matrix of beliefs and worldviews and assumptions. We already have this big lumping thing of all these bits and pieces that are reinforcing each other. And it's actually getting in the way of us being able to see and experience the truth that it is within, the infinite consciousness that goes on in all directions outside of this mental matrix that we've created. It cannot comprehend what it is within, in the same way that a fish doesn't really know that it's swimming in water because it's all around it. We don't often think about the space that we move and live in and breathe. We don't think about that because our mind is so focused on the objects, the concepts, the things, the tangible things, that it doesn't recognize the background space. So really the path of spirituality is not about putting together this new thing that is truth, but looking at our own mind processes and our own mental matrix and breaking it apart and realizing that it was just a house of cards built on beliefs and assumptions that we cannot verify in our direct experience. And so the more that we take apart and release and surrender these beliefs and these assumptions and this dependence upon this mental matrix, this dependence upon the functioning of the mind to tell us what reality is, rather than just directly experiencing it. The more that we do that, then the more we understand that it's actually not an increase of complexity, but a decrease of complexity into fundamental infinite simplicity. But the mind takes that to be a very complex and very involved process because it's taking itself apart. You're helping it take itself apart, and that's very, very hard to do because it is such a complex creation that we have. So that's my message for today. The simplicity of non duality, really, and the complexity that the mind brings to our experience, and how the path of spirituality is a movement from the complex into the simple, out of the mind and into direct experience, out of duality and into non duality. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little bit shorter than the others, which is great. I'm sure you like that. If you enjoyed what you saw here, hit a like down below and comment. Let me know if this rings true for you, if you have any questions about it or about your own spiritual path, or it's if you feel overwhelmed or like the whole spiritual transformation is way too complicated for you, reach out. I might be able to offer some clarity, some simple understanding, and some ways to go that might help you get through that. I love interacting with you, and I love that opportunity. So I love to hear from you. And if you want to be notified for future videos as they're released, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and they'll pop up on your feed when they're released. So again, to conclude, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Don't worry, I've got a lot more content for you to enjoy. Click the link to the right to see a video that goes hand in hand with what you just watched. On the left is a playlist I recommend you check out. And down below, you can see my latest video release. Your support means the world to me, so thank you.